The story can be found in Luke chapter 15. The story can be found in Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. Let's go there. Luke chapter 15 verses 11. The story is found of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15 verses 11. This is where it starts. So I'm going to read through the whole thing. We're actually going to go through 11 to 19. 11 to 19. We're going to go over that segment of the chapter today, and we're going to do part 2 another time. So we're just going to go over 11 to 19 tonight. All right? So I'll read it. I'll read the whole thing. It says, "And he said, a certain man had 2 sons." Verse 11. "And he said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him, and had compassion, and ran, and fell on his neck, and kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, Bring forth the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead, and is alive again. He was lost, and is found. And they began to be merry. Now his elder son was in the field, and as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants, and asked what these things meant. And he said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received them safe and sound. And he was angry, and would not go in. Therefore came his father out, and entreated him. And he said, and he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment, and yet thou never gavest me a kid, that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed for him the fatted calf. And he said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother was dead, and is alive again, and was lost, and is found. Okay, cool. So that is the whole story of the prodigal son. But tonight, we're going to be focusing on verse 11 to 19. Verse 11 to 19. Let's get right into it. So, verse 11 to 19 says, verse 11 says, And he said, this is Jesus speaking now, and he said, a certain man had 2 sons. So Jesus begins to speak this parable. So verse 11, this is Jesus speaking, and says, And he said, a certain man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And he divided unto them his living. Then we read verse 13, and says, And not many days after, actually no, we're just going to focus on verse 12. I'll say it one more time. Verse 12, it says, And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. Who divided unto them his living? It was the father that divided unto them, his 2 sons, his living. But it's the younger son that wanted to leave. So there's a few things that caught my attention here. There's a few things that caught my attention here just at the beginning of this parable. 1, we see here that the younger son wants to remove himself from the father. The younger son has decided to remove himself from the father. That's the first thing that I see here in Luke chapter 15, verses 12. So the younger son wants to remove himself from the father. The next thing that I see here is that not only does the younger son want to remove himself from the father, but the younger son, in wanting to move himself away from the father, still feels entitled to the father's goods. You know, the younger son wants to move away. He wants to move away from his father. He wants to remove himself from the father. But he still feels entitled to his goods. Even though he wants to move away, he still feels entitled to the father's goods, to what the father possesses, to the father's blessings. He still feels entitled to the father's goods. So, two things so far. One, the younger son wants to remove himself from the father. Two, the younger son, while wanting to remove himself from the father, still feels entitled to the father's goods. Three, now there's a third thing. If we read here in verse 12, it says, "And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth unto me, and he divided unto them his living." The third thing that caught my attention, or that God helped, me understand, is that the younger son, in wanting to remove himself from the father, understood that he couldn't remove himself from the father without these goods, without part of the father's living. Are you hearing me? So the younger son, not only did the younger son want to remove himself from the father, not only did the younger son not only did the younger son feel entitled to the father's living, to the father's good, while wanting to remove himself, but the younger son understood that in order to survive wherever he wanted to go, in order to survive, period, maybe, you could say, he understood that he needed the father's living. He needed part of the father's goods, part of the father's living, part of the father's possessions, part of the father's blessings. Another thing that I see just from this verse alone is that if the father had goods to part to his two sons, it must mean that the father had been storing up. The father had been storing up goods for his two sons. The father had been saving up his living for his two sons. So that's another thing that I see in this verse. And then the fifth thing that I see, the fifth thing that I see in Luke chapter 15, verses 12, is that the father's goods, the father's possessions, is made up of his living. The father's possessions, the father's goods, is made up of his living. So in verse 12, I'll read it again. It says, "And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living." So one, the younger son wants to remove himself from the father. That's one. The younger son wants to remove himself from the father. Two, while the younger son wants to remove himself from the father, he still feels entitled to the father's goods, to the father's possessions, to the father's blessings, to the father's living, as it says later on. That's number two. Three, the younger son understands that even though he wants to remove himself from the father, he still needs, as a necessity to survive, as a necessity to exist wherever he wants to go, he still understands that he needs the father's goods to survive. He needs the father's goods, or else he won't be able to go wherever he wants to go. He needs the father's blessings. Are you getting me right now? He needs the father's blessings to be with him, while he also wants to remove himself from the father. But he understands that if he doesn't have the father's goods, if he doesn't have the part of the father's living, that he can't truly remove himself, from the father. Fifth thing, the father's goods. We see here that the father had been storing away goods. The father had been storing away his possession that made up his living for his two sons. That's the fourth thing we see. And the fifth thing we see here is that the father's goods were made up of his living. The Father's possessions means the Father's living, okay? Possessions, blessings, goods, you know what I mean, okay? And that made up his living. All right. So now, when I read this, you know, whenever I'm studying, I'm always asking questions. And when I read this, I had to ask a question. And the question was, how does living fit into this verse? Because I know that it means goods. I know that it means the portion of goods, but it caught my attention. I needed to know. It says, and he divided unto them his living. Because whenever people talk about the prodigal son, you know, they always make they always make suggestions saying that the father is God. And so I had to know if the father is truly God in this story, you know, what is his living? You know, what is the living? Okay, what is the portion of goods that he's bestowing upon the son? I had to find out. So I had to look at the definition of the word living, and this is what I found. Living means pertaining to, suitable for, sufficient for existence. That is what living means. It means pertaining to, suitable for, or sufficient for existence. So the father gave the younger son a portion of the very thing that allowed him to exist. The father gave the younger son a portion of his living. His living meaning the very thing that allows him to be who he is. That is what the father gave to the son. The father gave to the son a part of his living. And according to definition, living means something that's pertaining to existence, something that's suitable for existence, or sufficient for existence. So in my mind, the father gave the younger son a portion of the very thing that allowed him to exist. The father gave the younger son that wanted to remove himself a portion of the very thing that allowed him to exist. We'll get back to that later. Verse 13. Let's move on. Verse 13 says, and not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. That's verse 13, yeah. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. So we see here that, let's break this verse down now. So it says, and not many days after. It says, and not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country. Pause there. Let's think about this for a second. So we see here in verse 12, a son wanting to remove himself from his father, wanting to, you know, be an individual and just be on his own and just move away from his father and just do his own thing. All right, so this is what we see in verses 12. But verses 13, the beginning of verse 13, it just shocks me because it says, and not many days after. It says, and not many days after. What does this tell me? And not many days after. It tells me that many days did not elapse before this younger son reached the far country. It says, and not many days after. So once the younger son had made up his mind, you know, I want to remove myself from my father. I mean, a week didn't even elapse, and he was already in a far country. A week didn't even elapse. It was just a few days, and this younger son was already in a far country. That's serious. You know what that tells me? That tells me that younger son really wanted to get away. That younger son really wanted to get away from his father. How do I know this? If you make the decision that you want to remove yourself and you're already in a far country just shortly after, that's serious. And back then, they didn't have cars. They didn't have airplanes. They didn't have all that transportation. So in my mind, when I'm thinking of this young son, I mean, he's like beating the camel to hurry up. He's like beating that camel to hurry up. You gotta drive. I want to get to that far country quick. He wants to get to that far country quick. It says, and not many days after. That means he packed up. He got ready to go quick. And he was already in that far country. not many days after, as the verse tells us in the beginning of Luke chapter 15, verses 13. That's serious. Next thing I want for us to see in verse 13. It says, and not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country. So we see here that the younger son had directed his ambitions, had directed his focus towards or on this far country. His sights were set on this far country. And, I mean, it seems that he really wanted to get there. It seems that he really wanted to get there because he only got there in a short time span. He really wanted to get to this far country as fast as possible. ASAP. He had to get to this far country. And as verse 13 tells us, he did in a matter of days. In a matter of days. He had to get there. He was in a rush. He wanted to remove himself from the Father and just head out. Experience life on his own. And let's finish the verse now. So we see here that the son wants to get away from the Father ASAP as soon as possible because he needs to get to this far country. And we see how much he needs to get to this far country because it says that he gets there in just a matter of days. And then let's read the last part of verse 13. Let's read the last part of verse 13. It says, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. So when it talks about a substance here, it means the substance that he had wasted is the same substance. It's the same substance that we see in verse 12. It's the substance that he wasted here in this far country, or the substance that the far country had caused him to waste. That substance was given to him by the Father. That substance was part of the Father's goods. That substance was the Father's possessions, was the Father's blessings. And just as we saw for the definition of living, the Father gave the younger son a portion of the very thing that allowed him to exist. So we see here that the younger son wastes what the Father had given him, which is the very thing that allowed the Father to exist, that allowed the Father to be rich, that allowed the Father to have all these servants. The son wasted the blessing that the Father had bestowed upon him. He wasted it. He just wasted it. Wasted it with what? He wasted it with riotous living. He wasted it with riotous living. I want you to look at something right now. Turn to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Turn to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. I want you to see something right here. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Let's go there. Let's go there. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Let's go there. Let's go there. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Let's see what it says. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. It says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Now let me ask you guys a question. Could it be possible? Could it be possible that the younger son had hoped for a better life in this far country? Could it be possible? Faith is the substance of things hoped for. Could it be possible that the younger son had faith in his decision that going to this far country would, be a good investment for him? Could it be possible that the faith that he had in this far country, that this faith could be given? Could it be possible that this young man's faith was part of the Father's goods that was bestowed upon him? Because it says he wasted his substance, and we know that the substance that he wasted was given by his Father. So could it be possible that the Father, in giving part of his living, gave him faith? Could it be possible that part of the living, that part of the goods that the Father had bestowed upon the Son was faith. Faith for something hoped for. Because we know that the Son wanted to get away from the Father as soon as possible. And he wanted to go to this far country, and he got there in a matter of days. I'm thinking this guy has he has an investment that he needs to finalize in this far country, and he just wants to get there. And he had hope for a better life, and faith is the... What does it say? What does it say? Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Just go there. Read it again. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. It says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is the substance. Faith is what the Son had received from the Father, because the Son received substance from the Father. The substance, the very same substance that the Son wasted in this far country, he had received from the Father. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. The Son had hoped for a better life in this far country. But we see here that it was wasted. His faith that the Father had given him was wasted. It was wasted on riotous living. It was wasted on riotous living. So we need to find out what this riotous living is. We need to find out what this riotous living is. Well, before we go over what riotous living is, we need to find out who is the Father in the story. We need to start getting some characters out the way. So we need to find out who is the Father in this story. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6, so we can find out who the Father is in the story. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6. And it says, but to us there is but one God, the Father of whom are all things, and we in him, one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we by him. So we see here in this verse, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6, that God is the Father. God is the Father. So in this story, when it talks about the Father, when it mentions the Father, it's talking about God. God is the Father. So what gift, what blessing, what possession, what living, what part of his living could God possibly give this younger son? Could it be that the Father gave the younger son faith in Jesus Christ? Could it be possible that the younger son understood that he needed part of his father's living in order to survive out there? Could it be possible that the younger son understood that he needed Jesus in order to survive out there in the world or wherever he was going to go? I think it's possible that the son knew that the father was going to give him. I think it's possible that the younger son who wanted to go away understood that there was life in what God was trying to give him. There was life in what the Father was trying to, the Father was bestowing upon him. There was life. He had hoped for a better life. He had hoped for something better. He had hoped for a better life in Jesus Christ. But he wasted it. His faith in Jesus Christ, his faith in the only one who could lead him into true happiness, who could lead him into a better life, even though he wasn't in the same house as the Father. I mean, regardless of where he went, with the substance that the Father had given him, I mean, he would get to where he needed to be. But he wasted it. Just as verse 13 says, he wasted it with riotous living. So, in the story, God is the Father. In the story, the substance or part of the living that God had given him. And we saw here at the beginning again that the living is talking about the very thing that allows him to exist, the very thing that allowed the Father to exist. God cannot be God without Jesus. Right? God cannot be God without Jesus. We looked at the definition for living. It says pertaining to existence, suitable for existence, sufficient for existence. So we came down to the denomination that to the common denominator that the living that was separated, that was given to the youngest son, allowed the Father to exist, allowed the Father to be in existence. So we focused that point on saying that, the Father was giving the Son something that, allowed him to exist. So Jesus is what the Father gave the Son. Jesus, or faith in Jesus, is what the Father gave the Son. So God gave the younger son, who wanted to remove himself from the Father, who willingly chose to remove himself from the Father, the faith in Jesus Christ, which would be his substance, which would carry him, which would establish him, which would carry him throughout the rest of his life if he kept onto this substance the right way. But we see here that in verse 13, it says he wasted his substance. He wasted the substance with riotous living. He wasted it with riotous living. So now, I want you to turn to Jeremiah chapter 8, verses 19. Because we see here that he wasted it. He wasted his substance. He wasted his faith in Jesus Christ. He wasted it. He wasted it with two things. Two things were involved in his wasting of the substance. Two things were involved. The first thing was his environment, where he was, which is the far country. And the second thing is what he did, which was riotous living, the actions that he took while he was in that far country. Okay? So two things caused the young son, the prodigal son, two things caused the prodigal son to waste his substance with riotous living. One was the environment where he was, which was in the far country that he got that he got to in a matter of days. And the second aspect is what he did here, the actions that he partook while in the far country, which we see here in verse 13 as riotous living. So turn with me to Jeremiah chapter 8, verses 19. Jeremiah chapter 8, verses 19. Turn with me to Jeremiah chapter 8, verses 19. Jeremiah chapter 8, verses 19. And it says, "Behold the voice of the cry of the daughter of my people, because of them that dwell in a far country. Is not the Lord in Zion? Is not her king in her? Why have they provoked me to anger with their graven images and with strange vanities?" I'll read that again. Jeremiah chapter 8, verses 19, it says, "Behold the voice of the cry of the daughter of my people, because of them that dwell in a far country." Where was the son? In a far country. Is it not the Lord in Zion? Is not her king in her? Why have they provoked me to anger? He's talking about the people in the far country now. He's saying, why have they provoked me to anger with their graven images and with their strange vanities? So keep that in your minds right there. So the people in the far country, the far country are doing two things. They're practicing idolatry because they're worshiping graven images. They have idolatry in their hearts. And the second thing is that they're doing practices that can only be defined as strange vanities. Okay? So two things: graven images, which is idolatry, and strange vanities. Okay? So now we're going to look up the definition for riotous. All right? Now we're going to look up the definition for riotous. We're going to find out what riotous means. Okay? Because it says he wasted his substance. In verse 13, at the end of Luke chapter 15, verse 13, it says he wasted his substance with riotous living. So now we have to find out, what is this riotous living that this young son, partook of? What is this riotous living that the young son did while in this far country? Let's find out. We see here, if you look at the definition of riotous, or you look for words that are synonymous with riotous, you would find that riotous is completely synonymous with the word wanton. WANTON. Riotous is completely synonymous with the word wanton. And the definition for this word, the definition for riotous, the definition for wanton, what does it say? What's the definition for it? I'll tell you right now. The definition is without regard for what is right, just, or humane. Riotous living, right? Riotous living, number 1, without regard for what is right, just, or humane. 2, careless and reckless. 3, sexually lawless and unrestrained. 4, extravagantly and excessively luxurious in manner of living and style. Extravagant style, excessive style, luxury. That's the 4th one. It is these 4 activities that were prominent in this far country that all sorts of people were taking part of. They were without regard for what was right, just or humane. They were careless and reckless. They were sexually lawless and unrestrained. And all they cared about was fashion. All they cared about was fashion. They cared about fashion, luxury, how to dress nice, how to look good to people, And these are the idols. These are the graven images. These are the strange vanities that these people were taking, that these people were doing in this far country. So in this far country, all these things are taking place. And it is because all these things were taking place that caused the young son to waste his substance. The reason why I'm saying this is because a lot of us have removed ourselves from the Father. A lot of us have removed ourselves from the Father. All right? A lot of us have removed ourselves from the Father. I'm going to make this personal right now. A lot of us have removed ourselves from the Father. 1. Not only that, but we think that in removing ourselves from the Father, we are still entitled to the Father's goods. So we may remove ourselves from the Father, but we're like, God, please bless me. Even though we've chosen to remove ourselves from the Father. Lord, please bless me. We still ask for the Lord's blessings. We still ask for the Lord to supply for us, even though we've made the decision in our minds to remove ourselves, just like the young son did, from the Father. We still feel entitled to the Father's blessings, even after we've made our choice. Second thing, when it comes to making this personal, we see here that we want to, in the beginning of verse 13, it says, and not many days after, meaning that we want to get as far away from God as possible. And not only do we want to get as far away from God as possible, we want to do it in a short amount of time. Or we do it in a short amount of time. I mean, it's quick. It's just a matter of days. And then, Saturday we're in the church and we living it up. We're all holy on Saturday. But just a matter of days until we have moved far away from the Father. That's us. That's us. We have chosen in our hearts that we no longer want to be around God. We have chosen in our hearts that we no longer want to have anything to do with the Father. We want to remove ourselves, and as soon as possible, ASAP. And in a matter of days, we're far gone. Far country, way off. Right, that's us. That's us. And what takes place? What do we do there in the far country? We waste our substance. The faith in Jesus Christ, which is crazy. The faith in Jesus Christ, which defines us as Christian, which labels us as Christian, we waste it. We waste it. Where do we waste it? We waste it in the far country. How do we waste it? We waste it with riotous living. What takes place in the far country where we waste our faith in Jesus Christ in? What takes place there? sexual lawlessness, sexual unrestraint. Sexual lawlessness and unrestraint takes place in this far country. People that have no, we're in an environment. You know, when we remove ourselves from the Father with people who have no regard for what is right, just, or humane. They just do whatever they want. Do what thou wilt. That's the mentality of the people in the far country. They're careless. They're reckless. And they're not ashamed of it. They're careless and reckless, and they're bold about it. They're sexually lawless, and they're bold about it. They're sexually unrestrained, and they're bold about it. It's not like they shy away. They're like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. No, they declare it to the world. It's the norm in the far country. We see here that they care, that they put all their cares into fashion, into luxury, to dress nice. And these are the activities that take place in the far country. These are the situations that God's people, or people who are supposed to be God's people, find themselves in when we choose to remove ourselves from the Father, when we choose to remove ourselves from God, and we run off quickly to this far country, and we just get caught up into all this mess. Brothers and sisters, that's serious. That's serious. All because we just removed ourselves. We want to get away. We want nothing to do with the Father. Nothing to do with Him. And the Bible tells us we have nothing to do with Him because it takes a short amount of days for us to fully be in a whole nother country, doing all the things we know we shouldn't be doing. That's serious. Let's keep reading. Turn to Hosea chapter 13, verses 2. 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 Let's go there. Hosea chapter 13, verses 2. So we see here that idolatry is taking place in the far country. All right. Hosea chapter 13, verses 2. Hosea chapter 13, verses 2, it says, "And now they sin more and more, and have made their molten images of their silver and idols according to their own understanding. All of it the work of the craftsmen. They say of them, let the men that sacrifice kiss the cows." Let me tell you something. Idolatry is when men lean on their own understanding. That's what idolatry is. Idolatry simply happens when men lean on their own understanding, when men think that they can guide their own lives. That's when idolatry gets put into the picture. So, because of idolatry, all of these activities were taking place. Or because men were relying on their own understanding, because men thought that they had it all planned out, like the young son did. He thought he could just remove himself from the Father and just live life on his own. And because men lean on their own understanding, idolatry is born. And because idolatry is born, activities like this, like we just named, no regard for what is right, careless and reckless, sexually lawless and unrestrained, and extravagantly and excessively luxurious in manner of living and style. All of these things take place because men lean on their own understanding. All of these take place because men lean on their own understanding when it comes to every aspect of their life. We can't be doing this anymore, brothers and sisters. We can't be leaning on our own understanding, because it is when we lean on our own understanding, we remove ourselves from Christ, and then we get caught up into this mess in this far country. We get caught up into this fashion and this manner of living. We get caught up into this sexual lawlessness and unrestraint. We get caught up into this mentality where we think We think we can do whatever we want. We're reckless. We're careless. You know. We get caught up into this mess where we think that, you know, we have no moral judgment. We don't care for what is right. We don't care for what is just, what is humane. We just do whatever we want. And that all happens. That all stems down from us leaning on our own understanding. Now let's make an application to this part of the story, to the world that we live in today. I mean, we see all types of sexual lawlessness taking place. We see all types of sexually unrestrained people. I mean, we see men kissing men, women kissing women, men wearing women's clothes, women wearing men's clothes. I mean, things that just don't make sense. People who are, they adore, they worship fashion. They worship fashion. I mean, they can't live without it. And they may lie and say that, oh, you know, fashion's not my thing, but we know. Because, you know, once that girl passes by with that nice bag, or once you see the nice shoes, or once you see that nice suit, or that nice fur coat, I mean, you start talking. You can't stop. Because you actually have an obsession with the fashion, whether you believe it or not. We see here in the world today, I mean, people are careless. People are reckless. And they're proud of it. They're proud of being careless. They're proud of being reckless. It's like something to be worshipped. It's like something to be exalted. Oh, I'm reckless. I don't care what I do. I don't care about anybody. I don't care about this. I don't care about that. I mean, and then people look at this mentality like, wow, that guy, that person's tough. Far country living. We need to stop with this far country living, brothers and sisters. We need to stop with this far country living. We need to come back home. Because this far country stuff, it shouldn't be taking place. We talked about far country living personally. We talked about far country living in the world. Now let's talk about far country living in the church. Let's talk about far country living in the church. Let me tell you something. Let me be real with you guys right now. Let me talk about far country living in the church. Let me tell you something. The reason why certain people can dress the way they do in the church is because they're in that far country. I'm being honest. The reason why people can have careless and reckless attitudes and partake of careless and reckless activities while they're in the church is because they're actually in that far country. That's where they live. Their address can be found in the far country. That's why they do what they do. When you see that every Saturday is a fashion show, far country. When you see certain activities in the church taking place that resemble things in the world, far country. Hold up. Let me just get right to it. If I want to, if I want to worship God, let's just break it down. Let me just break it down. In the far country, we see here that sexually lawless activities take place. In the far country, we see here that people are sexually unrestrained. In the far country, we see here that people are careless. People are reckless. People just do what they want. Period. People, all they care about is fashion. All they care about is style and living extravagantly. And they have no regard for what is right. They have no regard for what is just. They have no regard for what is humane. In the far country, there's a thing called nightclubs. In the far country, there's things called nightclubs. And you know what takes place in nightclubs? Sexually lawless activity takes place in nightclubs. Sexually unrestrained activity takes place in nightclubs. Sexually careless, people who are careless, people who are just reckless. They had a couple shots of this and a couple shots of that and a couple cups of... that can make a person reckless. that can make a person careless. And you know, when you go to these clubs, guess what you see? You see people that, it's a fashion show in there, and an indecent fashion show at that, right? It takes place in these nightclubs, right? People in these nightclubs, they have no regard for what is right, just, or humane. They just do whatever they want. And that takes place in these nightclubs in the far country. So how do we think that we can try to mimic a similar environment and try to bring it back to the Father? It makes no sense. How do we think that we can take our far country ideas, our far country living, and try to input God in it? It doesn't make any sense, because as we see here in verse 13, because the younger son was in the far country, he lost his substance. Because the young son was in the far country, he lost his faith in Jesus Christ. He lost it because he was in the far country. So how can we think to possibly take far country activities and then input God in it and think that that's true worship? I'm just going to leave that at there. That's a whole nother topic, but I just had to speak on that in this video. I just had to. It doesn't make any sense. You can never take far country activities. Okay? You can never take or try to mimic far country activities and try to put God in it and think that it's going to work out. It just doesn't make any sense. It makes no sense. And if you call that extreme, I agree with you. It is extreme. Extremely truthful. That's what it is. So let's move on. All right, let's move on. So we see here in Hosea chapter 13, verses 2, that idolatry is leaning on your own understanding. When it comes to matters, when it comes to God's matters, when it comes to life, as Christians, we are not to lean upon our own understanding. We are to lean upon God's understanding. Because we see here that leaning on your own understanding, it just leads to idolatry, which just leads to sinning over and over, as the verse says. You just sin over and over, and we don't want that. We don't want to sin over and over. We don't want that. So this idolatry, where was it taking place? It was taking place in the far country. Okay. Turn to Romans chapter 8, verses 35. Let's go there. Romans chapter 8, verses 35. All right. We're going to get back to the story soon, but we have to turn to Romans chapter 8, verses 35, just to see something real quick. Romans chapter 8, verses 35. All right? Romans chapter 8, verses 35. Romans chapter 8, verses 35, brothers and sisters. Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8, verses 35. Romans chapter 8, verses 35, it says, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation," hold up, "shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril of sword?" It says, "Who shall separate us," Romans chapter 8, verses 35, "who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril of sword?" All right. So now after reading that, let's turn back to the story. Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15, verses 14. All right? Luke chapter 15, verses 14. I'm going to start at verse 11, and then we're going to read all the way to 14. It says, "And he said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living." Now, verse 14. "And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want." I'll read it again. Verse 14. "And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want." If you look at Romans chapter 8, verses 35, you see here that a question is being asked. In Romans chapter 8, verses 35. The question is, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Then the verse continues to go on to name things that actually usually separates people from the love of Christ. It says, shall tribulation? Tribulation actually separates people from the love of Christ. Shall distress? Distress actually can separate somebody from the love of Christ. It says persecution? persecution can actually separate somebody from the love of Christ. It says famine. Famine can actually separate somebody from the love of Christ. And it says here in verse 14 of Luke chapter 15, it says, and when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land. Could it be possible that the people in that land had separated from the love of Christ? Therefore, a famine took place? Could it be possible that the people in the far country, the reason why they were doing what they were doing, the reason why they were practicing idolatry, the reason why they were living life after their own understanding, could it be possible that the reason why they were doing that is because they had actually removed themselves, they had actually separated themselves from the love of Christ? Because we see here, Christ in this story of the prodigal son is the part of the living that the father gave to the younger son. And we see here that the younger son wasted his substance with riotous living. Could it be possible that in wasting his substance with riotous living, he had removed himself from the love of Christ? Therefore, a famine had taken place in the land. Could it be possible that a bunch of these individuals that were in this far country had removed themselves from the love of Christ, which allowed the famine to strike that country? It's true. Because the love of Christ was not in them, because they had separated themselves from Christ. Not only had they separated themselves from Christ, from the blessing that the Father had given him, they had also separated themselves from the Father. They had separated themselves from God as well. As we see in the Son's life, he separated himself from God. And not only did he separate himself from God, but he separated himself from God's gift, from God's blessing, from God's possession, which was his Son that he gave which was Jesus Christ that he gave to the younger son in order to survive out there. While being out there, far out there, in a far country, he wasted his faith in Jesus Christ, which allowed him to start taking a part of all of these activities. All of these activities, as we said, carelessness, recklessness, sexual lawlessness, and unrestraint, being obsessed with fashion, obsessed with an extravagant and excessive manner of living, having no regard for what is right, just or humane, taking a part of all of these activities, which the younger son was, led him to be in this far country, while a famine was taking place, while a famine hit. And the reason why the famine hit is because not only was the son like this, not only was the son taking part of these activities, but everybody else was doing the same thing. They were all following. They were all, they were all taking a part of it. They were all taking a bite of all of these activities that I just named. And because the love of Christ was not with them, let me repeat that again. Because the love of Christ was not with them, the famine had hit the country. Because all these citizens of the far country, because the love of Christ, because the love of God was not with them, the famine hit the far country. Are you understanding? I wish I was on Periscope right now. I'll tell you guys to tap the screen, but I'm not. Soon, maybe, soon. All right? So, we see here that the love of Christ was not in the citizens of the far country, neither in the younger son that left his father. And we see here that because, as a result of that, a famine hit the land that they were in. Okay, so verse 14 says, and when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. Now, verse 15. Actually, before we get to verse 15, we need to find out what famine is. Famine is actually, in definition, it means extreme hunger or starvation. So we see this land is experiencing a famine. And famine means extreme hunger or starvation. Now let's turn to Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 29. Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 29, so we can get a better understanding of how this famine, how this extreme hunger, how this starvation applies to the individuals, including the younger son that were in this far country. Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 29. Let's go. Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 29. Let's go. Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 29 says, Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 29 says, "And I will raise up for them a plant of renown, and they shall be no more consumed with hunger in the land, neither bear the shame of the heathen any more." I'll read it again. "And I will raise up for them a plant of renown, and they shall be no more consumed with hunger in the land, neither bear the shame of the heathen any more." So what is connected? What is connected to the hunger that a country experiences? Shame. Shame is connected to a famine. Shame is connected to hunger. Shame is connected to hunger. And we see here that famine isn't just any type of hunger. It's extreme hunger. It's extreme starvation. It's not just hunger like, oh, I didn't eat breakfast today, so I'm hungry. No, it's an extreme hunger. So we see here that in this land, this young son, not only was he really physically truly hungry because the land was experiencing a famine, but he was also experiencing a grueling, extreme shame. He was also experiencing a grueling, extreme shame. Now, why was he experiencing this shame? Why was he experiencing the shame in this far country? Could it be possible that the young son was experiencing the shame in this far country because he realized that all the activities that he was partaking of while in this country were all filthy? Could it be possible that he realized his eyes were starting to open to the activities that he was partaking of? Could it be possible that the young son was feeling shameful of being careless and reckless? Could it be possible that the young son was feeling shameful for being so obsessed with fashion and so obsessed with extravagant and excessive luxurious living? Could it be possible that the younger son was feeling shameful for being taking a part of sexual lawless and sexually unrestrained activity? So he was feeling that shame from doing all of those things. Could it be possible that he was feeling shameful for actions that he did while without regard for what is right, what is just, and what is humane? The young son that removed himself from the father, he began to feel shameful while there was a famine in the land, while things started to die down. While people were starting to get extremely hungry, so they couldn't take a part of certain activities anymore because, food was the priority now, because they had to get food because they were hungry. So while things started to die down, right, he started to feel shameful. While the dust starts to settle, he's like, wow, man, this is all. He's thinking about all the things that he did. He's like, wow, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I went with her and I did. I can't believe I went with his friends and I did. I can't believe I drank and I drove and I took part of this reckless activity. I can't believe that I just spent hours and hours looking at this type of clothing. I can't believe that he's thinking about all of these activities that he was doing while in this far country, and he begins to feel shameful. He begins to feel shameful of what he has done, of what he has done while in the far country. And a lot of times when people talk about this parable, when people talk about this story, they say that, oh, the younger son came to himself when it says that he came to himself in verse 17. I believe that the young son actually came to himself right there and then, or began to start coming to himself right there and then. While the far country was struck with this famine, he began to come to himself. He began to realize that, he's been partaking of all these filthy acts. He's been so obsessed with fashion. He's been so careless, so reckless. He had no regard for what is right. He had no regard for what is just, what was humane. He was so sexually lawless. He was sexually unrestrained. And he begins to realize that, all these things that, he was doing. He starts feeling shameful because of that. It starts piling up. It starts to feel horrible. He starts to feel horrible about himself. He starts to feel shameful while in this far country, while the famine strikes. Now, verse 15. Verse 15. And don't forget, verse 14 says, and he began to be in want. Want of what? I wonder what this younger son begins to be in want of. It says, and he began to be in want. So now we're going to turn to verse 15. We're going to turn to verse 15. All right? We're going to turn to verse 15. And I just want to tell you guys the definition for shame if some of you guys don't know what shame means. Shame actually means, it's the fact. Shame is the fact that brings about a painful feeling arising from the consciousness, all right? Arising from the consciousness of something dishonorable, disgraceful, improper, or ridiculous. That is what shame is. That's the best definition I can come up with shame. Shame is the fact that brings about a painful feeling arising from the consciousness of something dishonorable, something disgraceful, something improper, or something ridiculous. That is what shame is. And it says here, it's not a idea, it's not a doubt, it's a fact. So we see here that this young son, if he starts to feel shame, he doesn't think that he did these things and that he doesn't think that they were wrong. He knows for a fact that all the activities that he partook of, they were wrong. And that's why he starts to feel shameful. That's why he starts to feel disgraceful. That's why he starts to feel dishonored. That's why he starts to feel improper and ridiculous and filthy. It's because he understands this fact that these activities are filthy. He understands it. And he starts to feel shame because of it. Now, verse 15. Verse 15. So if like I said, I believe that the younger son started to come to himself in verse 14. So, with that being said, individuals who want to come to, who are to come to themselves and come to an understanding before they are to go back to the Father, they need to come to terms with what they've done. They need to come to terms with the activities that they have partaken of and understand that it is a fact. And not only is it a fact, but the reason why you are feeling shameful is because those activities are wrong. All right? Because a lot of times, the reason why we don't come back to the Father is because the activities that we were partaking of, we don't see it as wrong. And not only do we not see it as wrong, but we don't feel any shame. We don't feel any shame. We don't feel any shame. And that is why we can't go back to the Father. It's because the way we've been living is not wrong to us, and we feel no shame. How can you find a need to come to yourself, or how can you find a need to go back to the Father if you feel no shame? If you believe sincerely in your heart that all of these activities, that you've done, they're not wrong. You were just doing what you're doing. You're just living life to the fullest. You're just living life carelessly and recklessly. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being sexually lawless. There's nothing wrong with me having a body count over, let me not even go there. There's nothing wrong with me, it's just clothes. I don't talk about clothes all the time. I don't talk about clothes all the time. So it's just a couple of blunts. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a couple. We need to come to terms with the things that we've done in order for us to, be restored or be revived. We need to come to terms with what we've done. And that is something that everybody has to do on a personal level. On a personal level. I cannot do that for you. You cannot do that for me. Unless we've gone through the same things. But if we have not, it's a personal thing that we have to realize on our own. We have to realize this on our own. It's an individual personal step that we have to take when it comes to being restored, when it comes to going back to the Father, when it comes to being revived. We need to realize our sins, and we need to realize that we have a need, because it says here at the end of verse 14, it says, and he began to be in want. He realized that he needed something. He realized that there's something that was lacking in his life. That's why he began to be in want. After realizing, after feeling all of this shame because of the things that he had done, he began to be in want. He began to realize that he needed something. He needed something. That's the second thing when it comes to being restored, being revived, going back to the Father. I mean, not only do you have to recognize the things that you've done, but in recognizing the things that you've done, you have to see your need for something greater. You have to see your need for the Savior. You have to see your need for the Father, as we'll see in later verses. You have to see your need. You have to be in want. Because if you're not in want, let me tell you something. Feeling shameful, the feeling shameful part will make you be in want. The feeling shameful will direct you to being in want. The feeling shameful will direct you. It will lead you to the path of being in want, of understanding that you need something. That emotion of being shameful, of understanding the things you've done and how bad they are, and oh man, I need to turn around. I need to change. Shame helps people, or shame leads people on the path to being in want, on the path to recognizing that there needs to be a turnaround, there needs to be a change, they need something greater. They start to be in want. That's what shame does. All right, verse 15. It says this in verse 15, all right? In verse 15. So we see here that in verse 14, we see here that in order to feel shameful, your acts need to be factual to you, and you need to recognize your condition, okay? So pretty much shame happens when you recognize your condition. Shame occurs when an individual recognizes their condition, and that leads them to be in want. Okay, all right? So verse 15, let's read it. It says, and he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country and sent him into his fields to feed swine. Verse 16, it says, and he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. All right. So, we see here in verse 15 and 16, even though he started to feel shameful because of the famine that was occurring in the land, the dust was settling, and he started to realize all the things that he had done. Even in feeling shameful, even realizing that, he had a want, he had a need, we see here that he's still in the far country. He hasn't made the decision yet to go back to the Father. He's still in the far country. He's still traveling in the far country. We see here that even though all these things are taking place in the far country, and because he was in the far country, we see here that he still wants to be a part of it. He still hasn't let go. Connections to the far country still haven't been severed yet. He still wants to be a part. He still wants to be a citizen of this far country. All right? But, I'm guessing that, while he's still in the far country, common sense must be hitting him like a brick. Common sense, logic must be telling him, the reason why you're in this mess is because of the far country. The reason why you're in this mess is because of the far country. What has the far country done for you? This must be logic. This must be common sense hitting like a brick. I'm telling you. Common sense, logic must be telling this person, what has the far country done for you? The far country has robbed you of everything that you had. The far country has left you starving and hungry and miserable. The far country has left you wallowing in shame. That's all the far country has truly done for you. When the dust settles, that's it. Look at you. You're left miserable because of the far country and because of all the activities you were taking part of. Shameful. It's shameful. But even knowing this, even realizing this, he's still in the far country. He's still there. He's still traveling in the far country. Even being living evidence that the far country has done nothing for him. Okay? So verse 15, we see here that he went to a citizen. says, and he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country and set him into his fields to feed swine. All right? He went and joined himself to a citizen of that far country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. So we see here that, another citizen of this far country, you would think that the citizen would be like, oh, we're countrymen. We come from the same country. I'm gonna give you a place to stay. I'm gonna give you something. I'm gonna give you some food. I'm gonna give you a respectable. You may have to work, for your food or work for your living, but it's gonna be something respectable because me and you are from the same country. I got your back, you got mine. While this famine is going on. Nope. We see here that this fellow countryman gives him a disgraceful occupation. The fellow countryman gave him a disgraceful job. It says, he set him into his fields to do what? Not even to pick corn or not even something like that. He set him into his fields to feed pigs. This is your fellow countryman? This is the reason why you rushed so quick to get to the Father? Just so you can be miserable and to have your fellow countrymen that you were once, partying with to just tell you to work for some pig? Feed some pigs? That's disgraceful. And who's giving him this disgraceful occupation? It's this fellow countryman of his that was in this far country. That's sad. So we see here that people of the far country, they didn't respect him. People of the far country, they didn't have his best interest in mind. They truly didn't have his best interest in mind. They truly didn't respect him, because if they did, the citizen wouldn't just throw him to go feed some pigs. The far country does not have your best interest in mind. The far country does not truly respect you. The far country wants to rob you of your substance and leave you miserable. That is the agenda of the far country. We got to get out. We can't stay in the far country, brothers and sisters. We can't stay any longer in the far country, because all sorts of sexual lawlessness and sexual unrestrained activity is taking place in this far country. All sorts of carelessness and recklessness is taking place in this far country. All sorts of obsession with luxury and manner of living and fashion is taking place in this far country. Individuals in this far country, citizens, they don't respect you, and they have no regard for what is right. They have no regard for what is just, and they have no regard for what is humane in this far country. You gotta get out. You gotta leave. But we see here that the young man, after experiencing all of that, he's still in the far country. He's still in the far country. So we see here in verse 16 that the citizen let him. In verse 16 of Luke chapter 15, we see here that the citizen lets him, feed some pigs. At least he gives him something to do. But feeding pigs, come on. You might as well be a pig too. That shows you how much the far country respected him. All right? So we see here in verse 16 that this fellow countryman of his sends him to go feed some pigs. All right? And then it says, and he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat. When I look at the word fain, it means gladly. F-A-I-N. Fain, it means gladly. It means willingly. So we see here that in verse 16, he would gladly and willingly have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat. The brother was hungry. He was so hungry that he would gladly and willingly eat pig's food. As a matter of fact, he probably would eat pig too. It's crazy. He was so hungry that he would gladly and willingly eat pig's food. And he probably would eat pig too. You know what I realized about being in this far country? There's unclean diet in this far country. There's unclean diet in this far country. Being in this far country, after a while, you're going to start wanting to eat some pig's food or some pig. Your diet starts to change because you start to get hungry. Partaking of all these activities, all these sexually lawless activities. It starts messing with your mind, starts messing with your mental, and you start doing things you shouldn't. You start partaking of things you shouldn't. You start thinking of eating things gladly and willingly that you shouldn't be eating gladly and willingly. Diet gets altered from what should be true to what is not beneficial to you while you're in this far country. He wanted to eat pig's food. He wants to eat husks. Husks are like the leafy part of the corn. If you look at a corn on the cob, it has like the leafy part. That's what a husk is. But imagine, a husk in a pig's, where pigs are, it's probably all muddy and all, He would gladly and willingly eat it. That is what he had been reduced to while being in this far country, brothers and sisters. And that is why I'm so adamant. That is why I want you guys to understand that you need to get out. Because you're not worth that. You're not worth to be crawling around pigs and wanting to eat pig's food and partaking of all of these filthy activities for what? Just to be miserable for the rest of your life? We need to get out. We need to get out of this far country at whatever cost. I mean, anything is better than being in the far country. Anything is better, it seems. It says, and he would fain, so he would gladly and willingly have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. Can you believe that? All right, so he wanted to eat some pig or some pig husks. He wanted to eat some, whatever was in that muddy, he wanted to eat that. And was he allowed to eat it? Nope. That's how little respect. That is how the far countrymen treated this brother. They wouldn't even let him eat pig's food. The pigs were more valuable than him. They wouldn't even let him eat pig's food. And that's the thing. When you're in this far country, that is what it reduces you to. That's sad. They wouldn't even let him eat the pig's food. That means that the pig was more valuable than him. And he was the one feeding the pigs. And he couldn't even eat what he was giving the pigs. I mean, that's sad. That's sad. That's sad. So in realizing all of this, in realizing that no man could satisfy his hunger, in realizing all of this, we have to go to verse 17. In realizing all of this, we have to go to verse 17. It says, and he came to himself. And he came to himself. I mean, he should have came to himself a long time ago, but at least now he came to himself. He came to himself. So after all this riotous living, and then the famine hits the land, and then he's severely hungry, he starts to feel shameful, he starts to be in want. He goes to work for a fellow countryman. The fellow countryman tells him to go work in a pig stable, to feed pigs. I mean, it's all muddy, dirty in there. He can't even eat what he's giving the pigs. He's less valuable in this country than pigs. I mean, after all of these steps, then he came to himself. He realized. And that's the thing. People that leave the Father, people that leave the church, or that leave God, or withdraw from the Father, they have to come to themselves. It doesn't say that the countryman helped him come to himself. It doesn't say that the Father helped him come. It doesn't say that the Father exactly. It doesn't literally say that the Father helped him come to. It doesn't say that him feeding the pigs and the pigs helped him. It says he came to himself. He had to make the decision. He had to realize on his own what he truly needed, what he was in want of. He had to realize it. A lot of times when people leave God, a lot of times when people leave the church, we run after them. when that shouldn't be the case. Because they have to realize on their own, after everything they've done, they need to come to terms with, wow, this is a fact. This is what I did, and this is so filthy. I need something greater. They start to be in want. And even though they might stick in the far country, after a while they won't stick there no longer, because they'll realize, I mean, this far country has no respect for me. This far country does not have my best interest in mind. And once they start to realize that, and once the far country degrades them to such a level, then they say, all right, then they come to themselves. And what we see here in verse 17, it says, this right after it says in verse 17 that he came to himself, it says, how many hired servants of my father's have bread enough, and to spare I perish with hunger. The first person he thinks about, the first thing he thinks about when it comes to coming to himself is his father. His father, pondering upon God, allows him to come to himself. You know, this is something that I tell my youth director all the time at my church. This is something that I tell her all the time. I tell her, listen, bringing the lost sheep of the church, bringing the people who have turned away from God to water country, it's not going to bring them back to the Father. It's not going to help them come to themselves. I mean, let's be honest. Let's be honest. Doing all sorts of activities is not going to really help a person come to themselves. They need to hit rock bottom. They need to hit rock bottom because they've chosen that they wanted to be in the far country. So let them be in the far country. And when they hit rock bottom, they have to come to themselves. They have to come to themselves. They have to come to themselves. It's not, you can't help somebody come to themselves. And not only that, if you would want somebody to come to themselves, who do you have to make them think on? Who do you have to make them ponder about in order for them to come to themselves? It's the Father. It's the Father. It's the Father. They had to ponder. The Son had to ponder upon. The Son had to ponder upon, how good the Father was. The Son had to ponder upon, how good all the servants had it. They were eating right. And when he was thinking about all these things, then he realized, I was like, man, I had food to eat when I was there. When I was in the Father's house, I had food to eat. I wasn't hungry. Not only was I not hungry, but I wasn't doing all of this foolishness that all these far country people are doing. I didn't care this much about fashion when I was in the Father's house. I didn't care this much about sex and about sexually lawless behavior and about, being careless and reckless. I didn't care about all these things while I was in the Father's house. I was good while I was there. I had all my needs taken care of while I was in the Father's house. You can only bring someone to the realization, to the reality of coming to themselves by giving them the Father, by helping them ponder upon the Father. Only focusing on the Father aids a person in coming to themselves so that they realize their condition. And I believe that, this young son, when he came to himself, he realized it. He realized it as every true Christian realizes it as well. He realizes, I'm wretched. I'm miserable. I'm poor. He recognizes his fallen state. He recognizes his need. He recognizes his need for a savior. He recognizes his need for the substance which was lost, that he had before, that the Father had bestowed upon him. And not only that, he recognized the person that gave him that substance, which was God. He recognized it. And this allowed him to come to himself. Revelation 3:17 says the same thing. Revelation 3:17, it says, because thou sayest, I am rich and increased with goods, and have need of nothing, and knowest not that thou art wretched, and miserable and poor and blind and naked. So, when he first left the father's house, he said, I'm in need of nothing. I can leave the father's house. I have need of nothing. I'm increased with goods. Look at all the goods that the father had given me. I'm increased with goods. I'm in need of nothing. But he did not realize at that moment that he was wretched. He was actually wretched because he couldn't do anything without what the father had given him. He couldn't do anything without the substance that his father had given him. He couldn't do anything. He didn't understand that he was wretched. He didn't understand that the very life in his lungs came from his father. He didn't recognize that he relied his existence only mattered because of his father. He didn't realize it. That he was wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. He didn't realize it. And because he didn't realize it at first, he got caught up into all of this mess. He got caught up into all of this mess. All right? He got caught up into all of this mess. So we see here in verse 17, it says, and he came to himself. He said, how many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? So we see here in verse 17, it said, we see here that he's beholding. We see here that he's pondering upon. We see here that he's focusing on the Father. And in turning his mind, his thoughts upon the Father, and turning his gaze from the far country to the Father, we see here that he realized that his Father was loving. His Father is loving because he feeds even his servants. He realizes that his Father is loving because his Father even feeds his servants. He realized that his father had food. His father had food. His father could, what his father had, it could sustain him. It could give him life. His father had the food. The far country didn't have the food. His father had the food. He realized that his father had security. His father had security. He would be safe. He wouldn't have to work in the pigs, He wouldn't have to work to feed pigs in the mud. His father had security. His father got it like that. And he realized that his father had life. Because if the young man didn't eat, eventually he would die. So because the father had food, it means the father for the young son, it means the father had life as well. So the son is just realizing all of these facts. He's just realizing all of these facts. And it's stabilizing, and it's making firm his decision to go back to the Father. It's establishing his decision to go back to the Father. All right? Verse 18 and 19. All right? Verse 18 and 19 is proof. Verse 18 and 19 is proof that he understood his condition. Verse 18 and 19, it says, and I will arise and go to my father, and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. So we see here proof that the son understood his own condition. Not only did he understand his condition, but he felt guilty of his actions. That's why he said, I have sinned against you. I have sinned against heaven. He fully understood the gravity of the things he done, of the things that he had done, and the consequences for them. That is what it truly means to come to yourself. You truly understand. You don't just feel shameful, but you truly understand the gravity of the things that you have done. How it affects not only you, but everybody around you, and even God. He came to himself. And then he firmly makes the decision, I'm going to go back to my father. He firmly makes the decision, I'm going to arise. He doesn't say, I will arise tomorrow. He doesn't say, I will arise next week. He doesn't say, I will arise maybe next year, maybe a month later. No, he says, I will arise. He's talking about presently. As soon as he makes the decision immediately, I will arise and go to my father and will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee. And the last thing that helps us understand that he truly recognized his condition is that he demoted himself. He humbled himself. He understood his condition. He understood his state. He understood his situation. He said, I'm not even worthy to be called your son. I'm not worthy. He said, when I go to my father, I'm going to tell him, yo, let me just be your servant. Let me just be your servant. And that's it. And I'll be content with that. Because even your servants have bread to eat. You take care of even your servants. So I don't even need to be your son. I'm not worthy to be called your son. Just let me be your servant and let me be accepted back into your home. And let me tell you something, just as fast as the young son went to the far country, I can imagine he went back home just as fast. Just as fast as him going into all of that craziness, all of that mess, he realized once he came to himself, he probably went home twice as fast. Because he understood that, in the Father's house, that's where it's at. That's where life is. That's where the truth is. That's where the food is. And he realized that his father was so loving and that his father would take him back. He realized it. He came to himself and he made the firm decision that, you know what, I'm going to go back to the Father. Cool. Another thing, he said he demoted himself from a son to a servant. He demoted himself from a son to a servant. So when a person comes to themselves, what do they gain? They gain the mind. They gain the mind of service. They gain a mind of service. When people realize their condition and they come to themselves and they realize the state that they're in and they realize how unworthy they are of the Father's love, they say, you know what? I have to serve this guy. I need to serve him because I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy of him. I have to serve him. When somebody comes to themselves, truly comes to themselves, they start to serve God. They start to serve God. And it's not, he didn't say that he would go to his father, a year later, a month later, a day later. He did it immediately. The service starts immediately. Talking about, people are on different spiritual levels. People, some people take time to walk. Some people, no, brothers and sisters, if you truly make the decision, you start to walk immediately. The reason why a lot of people use that excuse, the reason why a lot of people say that is because it's an excuse for their stagnancy. It's an excuse for them being in the same position for I don't know how many years. It's an excuse, and we need to stop it. Because as this young man did, once he made the decision, he started walking back home. He started taking those steps. So we have no excuse to be in the same spiritual position as we were 10 years ago. Have mercy. We have no excuse. Spiritual levels, that doesn't exist. It's either you walk or you don't. That's it. It's either you walk or you don't. And him saying, I will arise, that's nothing. He actually did it. So people, you can talk. You can talk the talk and say, I'm going to go to God. I'm going to do all that. But it's until you actually start walking that where people will start seeing that you really mean what you say. So we need to not only say that we're going to come to Christ, we need to actually start taking steps. And in the times that we're living in now, it's not even called steps. It's called strides. You need to start running. You need to start running back to the Father. You need to start running back. All right? All right? So that is where we're going to end. Verse 19, and then no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. This should be, the prayer. This should be the realization for all of us tonight. It should be, we're not worthy to be called thy son. We're not worthy to be called thy daughter. We're not worthy of that title. Lord, make me a servant. Lead me into service so that you can be glorified because you are truly good. You are truly loving. You actually care for me. While I went into this far country, you were looking out your window to see if I was coming home every day. You actually cared for me. You actually fed me. You actually, taught me how to work hard in your vineyard and how to, And even when I wanted to leave, you still gave me, a part of your living. You still gave me your blessing. You still gave me your goods. And once you realize how good the Father is, it should cause you to work. It should cause you to work. So my plea for all of you listening to this right now is to work. No more of this, everybody's on their own spiritual level just for an excuse to be stagnant, for an excuse to not be walking. No more of that. We're going to say tonight, I hope all of your prayers are, And it is mine too, that we're going to leave. We're done with the far country. We're done with the idolatry. We're done with following our own understanding. We're done with all the sexual activity, the sexual lawlessness, the sexual unrestraint, the recklessness, the carelessness, the obsession with luxury and fashion and luxurious manner of living, and all of this attitude of not having regard for anybody, not having regard for what is just, humane, right? No more of that. We're gonna realize our condition, and in realizing our condition, we're gonna start taking steps and start making decisions to go back to the Father, so that one day we can truly meet Him. I hope you all were blessed by this broadcast tonight. I know I took a long time, but when I start, I love talking about God so much, and about His love, and about our shortcomings, and how He is so good to us, and how I just love talking about it. And I love reading my Bible. So I hope you guys were all blessed. Stay studied, my friends. Keep reading your Bible, because in the Bible there's life, in the Bible there is truth, and in the Bible it is how we learn about the Father and about His love. And in learning about His love, we can truly bestow that love to other people as well. All right? So stay studied, stay in the Word. I'm praying for you all. Please pray for me as well, because I need them. And God bless. I'll see you next time. And remember, whether you like it or not, the truth is the truth.